Stuart Agnew is one of the heroes of our movement, ladies and gentlemen, our agriculture spokesman, and just the most fabulous man. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I can be heard. I've got a slightly different sound for me. Well, Jonathan Arnott rather stole my thunder talking about my opposite number in the Labour Party. He didn't tell you her name. Her name is Kerry McCarthy, and she doesn't like livestock farmers. I am a livestock farmer, so I cannot be accused of cozying up to her. However, this is about UKIP and agriculture and what our manifesto policies are, etc. For the 3 votes that we have been involved in or will be involved in over an 18-month period. And the first one, of course, was the general election, and I was here a year ago and I outlined UKIP's agriculture policy. And in a general election, nothing is off limits, really, as long as my policy was passed by the NEC and as long as none of it contravened the WTO, we could have a completely new policy. Well, that was the general election, and I offered at the time I would go round the regions and explain the policy, and by goodness, wasn't I taken up. And I went all over this country, and I was very well accommodated by the following, and I want to mention by name Phil Crossley, Antonia Willis, Andrew Mosley, the Graham Woods, the Paul Bullens, the Steve Crowthers, the Alan Hendersons, the Peter Harrises, the Robin Grays, the Peter Jewells, and the Steve Unwins. And those last 3 were PPCs who gave their all to our campaign. They abandoned their own careers completely. They were out there every single day. They stretched themselves financially. It was a hugely humbling experience for me to watch that, and it was most impressive, and you will applaud them now. Right. Well, that was the general election. Now we move on to the second vote that we're going to be confronted with, and that is the Assembly elections, the devolved assemblies in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. Now here, I cannot offer a comprehensive policy, because even if we wake up next May and our candidates have been successful in those 3 devolved assemblies and we have a majority in each one, we are still in the EU, we are still in the CAP, and we cannot offer something that is not deliverable. However, there is some flexibility. Whilst we can't alter the EU payment regime to farmers, that's known as Pillar 1, we do have some flexibility with what is known as Pillar 2 or the rural development payments. And I have delegated our policy for this to Edmund Marriage, who is sitting, and I hope he's going to stand. He is an expert in upland agriculture, and he will produce what I call a Pillar 2 policy, which will distinguish us from the other parties at those elections. So best of luck with that, Edmund. Thank you very much. Now we go on to the real meat of it, the referendum campaign. Well, we could produce a full policy at a general election, we can produce a partial policy at an Assembly election, but actually at a referendum, the day after we wake up and there is an out vote, it is still the Conservatives in government. So any positive policy, we hope it would default to my UKIP policy, but we can't guarantee it. So what I am concentrating on in this campaign is to try and point out what is happening to agriculture in the EU in the future. And Nigel was here yesterday saying, don't expect the status quo as we progress through this project. It is going to get a lot worse, and it's certainly going to get a lot worse for agriculture. And I would split this into 2 main headings. One is budgetary and finance, and the other is legislation and regulation. So if we look at budgetary and finance, there are 5 negative dynamics all building up against agriculture. Now, Jonathan Arnott talked about the excesses of the budget about half an hour ago. And the size of the EU budget is becoming a concern to many member states. It's getting very big, and they don't like having to have austerity programs in their own countries and yet having to keep shelling out to the European Union. And so they're beginning to resist it. But they also have an excuse not to give so much, because their contributions are based on their GDPs, and many of their GDPs are shrinking because they're in the euro, a currency they shouldn't be in. So the overall size of the cake is likely to get smaller. What about the agricultural share of that cake? Well, ever since I've been a young man, that has actually been decreasing from over 80% to under 50% now. That would have gone down even more in the last term if it hadn't been for the fact that the Agriculture Commissioner at the time said he would green the policy, and he managed to maintain that 48% on that. Well, greening has been an abject failure, and there's no two ways around it. The agri slice of that overall budget is going to come down, so a smaller slice of a smaller cake, but it doesn't end there. Farmers are paid in euros, British farmers, and that has to be converted into pounds, and because the euro has got weaker and weaker, that means British farmers are getting fewer pounds. And that isn't likely to reverse very quickly, because the euro is weak by virtue of the fact there are a lot of economies in it that shouldn't be in it. And so I cannot see that reversing. The fourth negative dynamic is the fact whenever a new country comes in, it is a net recipient of the budget, whereas we are net contributors. And that will have the effect of diluting the payments to farmers even more. And finally, the fifth dynamic is that the precedent of capping any individual farm payment has now been established in the European Union, and many might think that's a good thing, but it works more against British farmers because they're bigger farm size. So there are those five dynamics, and they all will happen to one extent or another. Now, on legislation and regulation, there is a firestorm coming down the tracks to my industry. It really isn't funny. Top of the list is the EU's attitude to pesticides. Hitherto, we would test pesticides on the basis of their risk to human health and the environment. The EU wants to use the criteria of hazard, not risk. Now, petrol is a hazard, we all know that, but we consider if we use it properly, the benefit is worth the risk. If the EU deem that any particular pesticide is above a certain danger, irrespective of the risk, we're not allowed to have it. That is going to knock out about half of our armoury. Even if they don't deem it as a particularly high hazard, it's going to cost an enormous amount for the manufacturers of these materials to actually get it tested. And in many cases, the cost of the testing will be more than they will make in a profit from selling the material, and that's particularly appropriate to horticultural growers, not much sold, but they need it very badly. And I think it's quite ironic that our Kerry McCarthy will only eat vegetables, and its vegetables are going to suffer from this EU legislation. It means that our horticulturists probably won't be able to grow them, so they will be grown elsewhere, and we will import the products that have been sprayed with the materials that we're not allowed to use. So we're going to lose about half of them, and that is going to put pressure on the others. There's going to be possibly more resistance to it. It is very worrying. I want to have a quick word about neonicotinoids. You may have heard about this, a difficult word to say. 2 years ago, knee-jerk reaction, these hurt bees. This was as a result of an experiment in a laboratory where they exposed the bees to levels of neonicotinoids they would never, ever experience in the field. If I drink a pint of beer, I'm exposed to some alcohol. If I drink a pint of alcohol, I am in serious trouble. That was the logic they used. They never did any field tests. The farmers have been most upset about this. They need the product. And the EU has said, well, all right, we will have some field tests. However, the size of the field has got to be a minimum of 42,000 acres. Nobody can afford to conduct an experiment, a field experiment on that size. That means they won't take it on. That means if you don't take the test, you can't pass it, so you will fail by default. It is really very, very worrying. But they've made it even, they shoot themselves in the foot, these people, because if we can't use neonicotinoids, we will repeatedly spray this young oilseed rape with pyrethroids. That's even more harmful to the environment, and we will build up a resistance to them. Roger was talking about climate change. He and I are great buddies on this. Well, big problems for agriculture. The two gases that are being vilified, carbon dioxide and methane. In CO2, farmers do emit CO2, but by goodness, we need CO2. Our crops cannot grow without it. It is the most essential plant food. Nevertheless, we're being told you must emit less. That means tractors, of course, and we're going to have to use them less, or we're going to have to try and bury the CO2. But crucially, there's a lot of CO2 used in the manufacture of fertilizers and that they are going to become a lot more expensive unless we import from outside the European Union. Same with steel and the manufacture of tractors and all farm implements. And don't forget the wearing parts of cultivators and ploughs. You keep renewing the steel, that's all going to get a lot more expensive. And all this is going to happen. It's going to raise farm costs. Now, the next dangerous gas is methane. And I had a joke about Daisy, the cow, and emitting methane. But I did say to Commissioner Hogan, look, how are you going to stop cows emitting so much methane? Hey, what are you going to do about it? And he said, well, there'll be a breeding program. That means we will have to select cows that produce less methane for a given amount of food intake. Well, first of all, you've got to establish what those cows are. So presumably every farmer goes into his cow shed and he measures Daisy's emissions and all the others there, and they have to log it all. And you come, there's a few there, I won't give them names, who give a smaller bang for their buck, or whatever you like to call it. And from those few, you've then got to try and breed from that one single trait. Now, that would take 50 or 60 years, and in that time we would all fry alive, wouldn't we? There's not time for that. Well, they could accelerate that breeding process. They could accelerate it if they used cloning and genetic engineering. If they were really so worried about methane, they would have to use those methods to accelerate the process. They won't use genetic engineering, they won't use cloning, so they're not going to get anywhere at all. But we will be put under a lot of pressure to reduce methane, which means herds and flocks will almost certainly get smaller. There are other problems. Nitrate vulnerable zones, this is EU legislation, it's very over the top, and they're tightening the screw the whole time, so we will have to use less nitrogen, which means less food produced. Asbestos, that's hanging on a thread. At the moment, I prefer to call it chrysotile, white asbestos, the cladding on farm buildings, on the roofs and on the walls. It should never be called asbestos, but it's been lumped in with blue and brown asbestos, which are very dangerous. Now, at the moment, if you have this material on the farm and it's a waste, you have to pay a huge amount of money to get rid of it. If it's sitting on the roof of a building, that's all right. But you measure this in acres across the country, hundreds of acres of this material across the country. And so there's already emails buzzing around the Parliament now, well, we must tighten up on asbestos, we must time limit it. So the farmers could be in for an almighty bill on that. Labelling, Elizabeth Truss cannot, she's DEFRA, the Minister for Agriculture, Secretary of State, she cannot say we will have country of origin labelling. The EU say the processors can have it if they want to. And all she can say to the processors is, well, please take up the EU's offer. And that's all she can do. Outside the European Union, of course, we will take control of that. But the European Union don't want member states. They want to erode the whole idea of that. So that's going to become more difficult. Futures markets. The MiFID legislation means that that's going to be more difficult, trading in futures, and I thought it was very ironic that the recent emergency dairy package said, the EU said, we're going to set up a futures market for dairy products. They should look at their own legislation. It's going to be virtually impossible to do it. Finally, I want to talk about TTIP, the new EU trade deal between the USA and the EU. What is the impact of this trade deal for agriculture? It's all being negotiated in secret. We think our beef industry can suffer. However, the agricultural chapter of TTIP is now available for MPs to read in the reading room, and I've got an opportunity on October the 12th to go and read it for 2 hours. However, before I go in there, I must sign a non-disclosure statement to say I will not say anything about what I've read. I'm not allowed to take a pencil in there, I'm not allowed to take a microphone in there, and I'm not allowed to take a camera in there. And if I can read the complicated legalese, let alone remember it, I'll be very lucky. But what is the point in me going and reading it when I can't tell anybody about it? That's the EU's definition of transparency. Well, if I do go in there and read something interesting, and I'm tempted to tell everybody, I will be fined, if I do so, €3,060 as a minimum. But because I'm UKIP, it'll be an awful lot more. And so my challenge to the farming unions is, well, if you want me to tell you what I've read about agriculture in the TTIP chapter on that, yes, I'll tell you, but will you pay my fine? And I'll be very interested to see their reaction to that. Thank you very much.